Our next speaker today is Professor John Skerritt. John fills three important roles within the Department of Health. He's currently the DepSec of Health. He's the head of the Office of Drug Control and the head, of course, of the TGA. I think everyone knows you in this room, pretty sure they do. Yep. Hello. So please welcome John to the stage. His presentation today is called Recent Developments from the TGA, and he'll be also followed with a Q&A. So welcome, John.
Thank you. Oh, good morning, everyone. And it's both a privilege and an inspiration to follow Judith Lacey. Oncology must be and is one of the hardest areas, both personally and professionally, for healthcare professionals. We much malign our healthcare professionals sometimes, but I've always found Judith an inspiration, and one of the real pleasures of working with medicinal cannabis, especially in depth since 2016, has been the involvement of people such as Judith. She's not alone, but there's been some real leaders among the medical profession. And I guess the other thing that I always, and I'm going to embarrass Judith, the other thing that always gets me is how positive Judith must be, because the sad thing, of course, in oncology is you lose a heck of a lot of patients. So, you know, we need more people like Judith. So I'm going to talk about a range of recent developments in TGA, ranging from some of the regulatory changes. There'll be a complementary discussion this afternoon after lunch about the Office of Drug Control from my colleagues, Avi and Danielle. And I've got to do the usual bloop. I've got to hit the green button and hope something happens. We don't know who's won the election yet because people are still voting. And the government's in this curious thing. When I try to explain caretaker convention to my equivalents in places like FDA, Australia is an unusual country that we have it, if you're a bit of a student of politics and all that. And when I try to explain that, they think, oh, does everyone walk around and clean everything and mop up? So here's my picture of caretaker convention. Yes, I know it does look like me. So basically, can't talk politics, can't speculate on what governments will do, because guess what, we don't know who the government's going to be. Really, I'm talking about the regulatory framework as it is. The other thing that I would observe is that while obviously it's up to an incoming government or minister of either colour to decide what they want to do with everything, including cannabis, in general, and this might be a surprise to you, but I frightened someone by saying the first time I had to do this caretaker stuff was under a guy called Bob Hawke, which probably shows how old I am. But the surprising thing is that generally 90% of a system as it is stays, and rules and regulations and laws stay until they're deliberately changed, either as a regulation by Cabinet or as a law by the Parliament of Australia. So, and there hasn't been, and I won't run a commentary, but there hasn't really been much discussion of cannabis, or except for the Greens, among their published election commitments around cannabis. So the intent of the Parliament, see, I'm on safe ground because this came through Parliament and that's bipartisan. It was bipartisan support for the changes to the Therapeutics and Narcotic Drugs Act, was to enable greater patient access. They wanted to stimulate the Australian industry. They wanted to make sure it was manufactured as a high quality medical product and available through doctor's prescription. Now, again, the view was that these are cannabis in a medicine is the view of the Australian Parliament, but as a medicine that's available through doctor's prescription. Now, recently, and I'll touch on it later, low dose cannabidiol is able to be available with a pharmacist support. It's in Schedule 3 medicines. You don't buy them from the front from the 15-year-old boy or girl who's working there on Saturday morning. You've got to go to the pharmacist. Two arms, and everyone gets confused who does what, including our own department sometimes. But there are two arms, and I have the pleasure of having oversight of both, although my colleagues in the Office of Drug Control do the day-to-day stuff, and you can see the differing roles there. States and territories had a role, and I won't run a commentary on the states and territories. Initially, I guess, out of a degree of risk aversion, and it was all new, a lot of the states and territories had quite significant extra hoops to jump through. And some of them required, you had to go through one of their committees to approve prescribing, and it really did involve an extra regulatory burden and so forth. As comfort with medicinal cannabis has increased, most states and territories have reduced the need for separate review. Now, it does vary. There's a certain state to the far south of Australia that still has a high degree of additional oversight. And look, states, it's a state and territory prerogative. Their parliaments pass the laws. But in general, most states and territories have pulled back on their degree of oversight. And it's really only, say, if someone, for a Schedule 8 drug containing THC, if someone has had various, and again, it's a loaded word, drug addictions, drug dependence, substance, I could use all the more appropriate words, but someone with a history of substance dependence may have their application looked at and discussions with the doctor about prescribing and controls on access and so forth. But in general, the states and territories over the last few years have really pulled back, and the sky hasn't fallen in despite the weather outside. And I think the states and territories realise that they've been, but look, you can say, oh, wasn't that terrible with 20/20 hindsight, but most new regulatory frameworks do come in with a high degree of caution. But when the sky doesn't fall in, rules are taken off. I mean, we all remember lessons of when cars first came in, you had to walk in front with a red flag. A bit hard to do on the motorway these days, you'd get squashed. But less flippantly, even those who have had ibuprofen, which is the second most common over-counter pain reliever, Nurofen, to use its more common name. Do you know you used to need a prescription for Nurofen in Australia? And that's an indication of how generally when new medicines come through, there's a high degree of regulatory oversight. Some of them stay that way because there's benefit, risk and concerns and safety. So not everything ends up on your supermarket shelves, but that medicine has gone from being a prescription, if you don't, go and Google it if you don't believe me, through to being available at 7-Eleven. Now I'm going to talk mainly about TGA stuff. That's our new building, by the way. We've finished the move in last week, but like every new move, there's still teething troubles. But we have a brand new building out near Canberra Airport. Don't worry, the taxpayers didn't have to pay for it. It's all tied up with getting it for free, but then paying rent. And of course we rent everything and no one owns anything more in government. These are a range of things I'm going to cover about. I'm mainly focusing on TGA stuff because I've got a couple of very capable colleagues from the Office of Drug Control who'll talk about ODC stuff. And so I'll take you on a journey through these things. So there was a Senate inquiry into patient access a couple of years ago. It seems like a century ago, but it wound up just before COVID, and government responded. They took a while because of a little thing called COVID. So the hearings from the Senate inquiry were in 2019. But with COVID, a lot of these government responses were delayed a bit. We actually, to the extent we could, started implementing things that we knew government would be happy with. And most of the things actually were implemented, and you can read the list. I'm not going to read that out for you. There were a couple that weren't accepted. Government actually took the view that it actually would slow patient access to establish a separate regulator. And it's true, having been through the business of establishing separate government bodies, where they've got to go and rent a building, work out whether to have potted plants, hire staff, all that stuff, you actually lose a couple of years in anything. And there's a real worry that the current momentum that we're seeing with patient access could actually have been lost if a separate... Now, that was a view of government. I'm just stating a fact that's in the written report of government. I'm not making a political view. A separate Medicare item for long cannabis consultations. There is a separate Medicare item. Now, Judith talked about the inpatient 1-hour discussion, but it is possible for a GP to have a long consultation. So that wasn't felt necessary because there's alternative mechanisms. A number of the recommendations, even though it was a federal government inquiry, and this is where you've got to love states and territories compare with federal, were really under the control of states and territories. So states and territories in Australia control driving laws. That's why you can do a U-turn at traffic lights in Victoria, but not in New South Wales. And why people who drive from Victoria to Sydney get booked for doing them. So these things, and I should stop talking about driving, although of course there's a very relevant thing about driving, and it's cannabis and driving. And so those issues relate to the states because the states basically regulate driving along with other things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about access to prescription medicinal cannabis. And it's through what we call the unapproved products pathway, because there's only 2 products that are TGA registered and only for specific childhood epilepsies and specific things related to multiple sclerosis. Judith talked about the authorised prescriber pathway, and just to recap, that's the one where a doctor who submits a description of a type of patients they're prescribing for is able to not have to come back and apply patient by patient. And it's because they're a prescriber with competence in that area. They have to tell us how many patients every 6 months, but you don't have to put in individual applications. The other form is generally having to put in individual applications, but as Judith commented, we've actually become a victim of our own success. And don't believe me. I mean, bureaucrats will always tell you that they're efficient. Don't believe me. It's now almost a same-day process, unless if, but it's not a rubber stamp. We approved 90-something% of them, but not 100. And what ones do we query? If either it looks like a mistake has been made or perhaps an error of judgment, a very high dose starting for, we've had examples where people have applied for very high doses for toddlers. Or for conditions that do seem, you know, a toddler who has trouble with sleeping, you don't give them high dose THC, but we've had those sorts of things in a small percentage of cases. And so it isn't a rubber stamp. But the overwhelming majority established conditions we wave through, but it isn't a rubber stamp. Now, why even have this oversight? Well, again, apart from those 2 products, they are not registered medicines. They haven't been assessed through the scheme. So the other medicines you go and get a prescription for from your pharmacy, it's been through, well, 4, 5, 6, 7 months of scrutiny by teams of people ranging from doctors, toxicologists, scientists, chemists and so forth. And they have been looked at in tremendous detail. And very few cannabis products have been through that anywhere in the world. And so, as I said, the scheme does have checks and balances, although I think about 97% of SASB applications do go straight through, but I am glad that the other 3% do get questioned. And often the doctor will say, okay, well, yeah, I think I'll try other things for my kid who can't sleep, or maybe the dose is way too high or something like that. So at least 250,000 prescriptions, because that's only from a special access scheme, and there's quite a few others we don't count or monitor. I think it's actually about 300,000 prescriptions for medicinal cannabis in Australia, which is quite a remarkable number. And the online system has made it easier. There's been a lot more authorised prescribers who don't have to come back one by one. Wide range of indications, but there is not a TGA approved list of indications. That's often said in the press. It's wrong. We do look at all indications case by case, and if it's an unusual one, if someone says ingrown toenail, we'll actually ask for evidence and appropriateness, you know. But there's no, I do need to emphasise there is no limit or control on here are the 6 or 7 conditions. In the US, that's very common in the different state and state medicinal cannabis schemes. Some of them have a prescribed list of conditions. We don't. A range of dose forms. The most common and popular ones are oral solutions. We do have a number of prescriptions, a very significant number, for cannabis flower made to quality standards. And that was an area, and telling a little bit of a tale out of school on election day, that was an area of hot debate. And personally, I was a strong advocate. At the end of the day, it wasn't my decision, it was government's, because I think for a number of reasons, if in a doctor's judgment, in consultation with a patient, it's not smoking, it's vaporising or other forms, that flower should be available. And I was delighted that our political masters listened to us on that one. Sprays and capsules. Now, most actually are THC and CBD mixtures. Now, it's been an interesting mix, and you've got to guess the state. You've got to guess the state and the animal. Pretty easy. Here's my quiz for the day. However, I should have replaced the cane toad with a duck, I think, given the weather. But interestingly, you're in the land of cannabis prescribing. Now, Queensland is only, I should know the figure off the top of my head, I think it's about 1/4 of the population of Australia at most, I think it's even maybe a little bit less, but some Queenslander will tell me. You'll Google it and you'll tell me what the figure is. Let's say it's a quarter of the population. It could be 23% or something. Anyway, if you find the number on Google, yell out. But look at it, it's 52% of prescribing. On the other hand, you've got places like South Australia that, even though we all might think South Australia is irrelevant, it's certainly not 0.8% of a population. It's, again, a population of a couple of million in a country of almost 26 million. So a quick bit of mental arithmetic, it's probably 8%. I should have looked up these figures, but it's massively unrepresented. And as for the Northern Territory, well, your chances of getting eaten by a crocodile are greater. Then again, they're probably pretty high anyway. So it's not proportional to population. Interesting, and I'm sure someone can do a PhD thesis on this, it's probably due to the number of doctors who are interested in prescribing. It's probably due to role of pharmacists and availability to immediate supply. It's due probably to patient awareness and need. Anyway, over to you guys to work out why, but it's lumpy. The second thing is, let's look at indications or symptoms. In other words, it's plain English. Pain is far and away the major one in different, but now again, any clinician you talk to will say pain is not one syndrome, but the group of pain syndromes is far and away the most common one, followed by anxiety, insomnia, and sleep to a smaller extent. But this is only the top 20. There's about 100 different syndromes that we actually have approved. That's why I say we don't have a list, unlike some of those American states. We streamlined the process for special access scheme come last November. Now, there's probably some people from companies, or if we sent them all off to the other room, they're probably in the tent. Anyway, this is a good case of people power where you've got the healthcare professionals and the consumers in the room, and we send industry off to a marquee or a big tent in the rain. Isn't it good? But anyway, to cut to a chase, this is not about declaring war on industry proprietary products, but in keeping with prescribing of medicines generally, to keep costs down, to enable pharmacists to substitute products, we say, unless if the doctor goes tick, you must have certain brand X and nothing else, you let the pharmacist and the doctor work on that to substitute. That's what we do with every other prescription medicine, because this was done in response to two things. Firstly, people were turning up with their script and they were having trouble getting that particular product and formulation. They'd then have to go back to the doctor, they'd have to apply to TGA again, they'd have to get another script, they'd have to go and fill another one. It was limiting patient access. Secondly, it was actually maybe driving people to, this is probably where I won't get free coffee in the industry tent, it was driving people in some cases to higher priced products, where there might be a product with a similar THC-CBD ratio, similar oil, and the pharmacist and doctor would say, okay, that one's a third of the price, because we do know that price is an issue, and I'll come back to it. So it is not, but if a prescriber or patient in their discussion wants brand X only, but like any script, the same way for a prescription med, you can demand, the doctor can demand, do not substitute with a generic. This has led to a lot of changes. People are now moving this pathway. It's also made the authorised prescriber pathway easy, because for the lower THC products, they have an easier way to get on being an authorised prescriber. And it's really streamlined the number of authorised prescribers. And remember, that's good, because this is a doctor who's used to prescribing cannabis products and actually is a trusted prescriber of those products. Now, there's been changes to pharmacy compounding. This is where pharmacists cook it up by themselves, basically. It's called extemporaneous compounding, but there were some concerns about quality of compounded products. Now, some pharmacists do a superb job, but others were, less experienced, or perhaps cutting corners or whatever. We had no visibility on what was being prescribed, how much, and so forth, and we were getting concerns expressed from a number of the state and territory health departments. They now have to have special access scheme or authorised prescriber approval. Again, not a big deal, as Judith says, unless it's something that's inappropriate, the approvals come through the same day. So it's generally straightforward. It also enables us to get better visibility of just what's being prescribed out there. And we're working with the pharmacy industry, and that was after a public consultation, that change. Just want to warn you, and people generally wake up when regulators say warn you about something called delta-8 THC. And the main thing is we don't know enough about it to be confident that people should be using it. Now, it has been promoted in the US in particular, and some parts are saying, well, it's a gentler, milder, nicer form of THC. But there just isn't the evidence out there in the medical literature. And I wouldn't want to take a medicine, a prescription medicine, with at least evidence on safety and whether it works and side effects, in fact. Now, Delta-8 is not natural at significant levels. It's a trace constituent. And so most of it is made by cooking it up. And again, there's problems sometimes with the cooking it up chemistry process and turning other things into Delta-8, THC or CBD into it. Now, in the US, there's been over 1,000 people admitted to emergency departments in the last 15 months with Delta-8 and over 2,000 going to poison centres. And the trouble is we don't know much about it, but both the US FDA has put out warnings as recently as this month. They've had people in coma in intensive care. The other trouble is that if you're very good at converting it, you can take a CBD product and suddenly you've got a 40 or 50% Delta-8 product. And okay, it might be slightly less potent than Delta-9, but you go and take the same sort of dose of Delta-8, you can end up knocked out. More than impeded, you can end up in a coma, and there's been quite a significant number of people in emergency departments in the US. Now it has been depicted in some parts of the media that we have made it illegal recently. No, they've never been legal, but we have clarified why they're not legal in the most recent changes to the product quality standard, or TGO 93 as we bureaucrats love to call it. It's not legal, and remember there's a lot of problem with the synthetic cannabinoids. People have and do die every month in Australia with synthetic forms of cannabis. Not plant cannabis, chemical synthetic forms that are often more potent than heroin on a milligram per milligram basis. And so things that are chemically manufactured are not considered medicinal cannabis in Australia. They're actually considered illegal drugs. It's also a prohibited substance in every state and territory. So I want to emphasise what we have done recently is spell it out in more detail, but Delta-8 has never been legal in Australia. You know, we may find in the future that at low doses it's got all these wonderful advantages, but as others have said this morning, bring on the research. We need supervised, evidence-based for your own safety. That's why we need it. Now, speaking about safety, a couple of years ago, we initiated a safety review of low-dose cannabidiol because of interest in that internationally. And the bottom line is that while the evidence was limited, it looked pretty safe at low doses. There were some side effects, tiredness, diarrhea, appetite changes, some liver functions. That's what this transaminase stuff's all about, which is a worry if it's persistent. Sedation, sleep disturbances, infection, anemia, but not consistent enough and not big enough to be a flashing red light. Cannabidiol does interact with other medicines, and that's still a bit of a land of the unknown. But we gave the green light based on public consultation, advisory committee, for low-dose cannabis to be a pharmacist product if it's in a registered TGA product. So it's not the special access scheme that we talk about, but if it's in a product where it's been through the TGA system and we've checked that it's pharmaceutical grade and there's evidence for it working in indication. A few other controls, 18 years and over, warnings about breastfeeding. The law currently says it can't be advertised to the general public. Now, that can be changed, but it will require a submission to the TGA, which again will go to an advisory committee and all that guff. So remember that many of these things, and it also includes dose, because one of the questions about dose is the cutoff is this 150 milligrams of cannabidiol. Now, that's what the law currently says. But again, we've had companies come to us and I've said, well, you do what you want. I'm not here to be a consultant for you, but you might want to in your clinical trial, if it's approved as a clinical trial by the ethics committee, you might want to have a medically supervised arm with 250 and one with 150. If you find the 250 one works, you could apply to the TGA, and if you've got all this safety data that no one's having safety problems, maybe it could be rescheduled to 250 for over-counter. So it's not written on clay tablets from God or whoever your God is. I'm not saying that the committee will advise that way, because we do tend to listen very closely to the advice of a big advisory committee of experts and consumer reps and so forth, but nothing is written in stone. And so some companies are doing 150 because that's what's in the law now, and they're hedging their bets with a 250 or 300 arm. But We're not making any promises. By the way, it's not my decision on this number. It's a senior medical doctor who acts on the advice of a committee. Anyway, we are talking to quite a number of companies. We will take the trials through. Australia could be a world leader here. Now, what sorts of things? It's not going to be for kids with epilepsy, because when you think about it, it's not so much a dose, but for conditions like serious, and these kids are very, very sick. Kids with serious paediatric epilepsy need to be under the care of a specialist and with regular oversight by a GP. So that's not appropriate to go to your corner pharmacy only. But if you look at things like mild anxiety, assisting with sleep, and melatonin's an example of a drug you can get from your pharmacy to help people with sleep without a prescription. Maybe PTSD, but again, that's got to be looked at just how. Pain is an interesting one. You can get a number of drugs for pain from a pharmacy without a prescription. We're not saying this is the list. Again, it's up to you guys and industry to advise on what the list should be. Whatever it is, we'll need clinical evidence. We've got to show it works. We're not in the business of having pharmacists sell pharmacist-only medicines that don't work. And I said the indications or the symptoms have to be suitable for a pharmacist. So things like epilepsy, you need to go to a specialist neurologist. So there's just a few of it. This is probably less of interest to this general audience. It's just mainly about making sure that the distribution systems align with the law, and this is something we're always looking at with companies. I won't dwell on this. This presentation will be available through the WOVA system and so forth, so I'll go on. The other thing that has been changed by government is to create a level playing field for domestic and international cannabis products on manufacturing. So at the moment, only domestic cannabis products have to go through medicines grade good manufacturing practice oversight. That's to make sure they're made to medicine standard quality. And that, again, there's been a number of cases on and off, and it wasn't just that rotten cannabis that was shown that the Americans were handing out from the University of Mississippi, but there's been a number of cases. In fact, there's even been a couple of deaths in the US and Canada from people with pesticide or fungally contaminated cannabis. If you inhale through a nebulizer or something or other, a fungus, it goes straight into your lungs, and there were some people in California who died. So quality of cannabis is really important if it's treated as a medicine. So, but there wasn't this level playing field. And while I don't think we've been importing rubbish from, and we've been checking it from overseas companies, and we've been doing random compliance programs, it was decided that from the 1st of July next year, imported cannabis will have to have the same quality standard as domestic. So it's a level playing field for our local industry. And hopefully, because standards are, the boats are being lifted by the tide, another water analogy, imported products will be available. So we don't think it will create a freeze on availability of product. And they'll have to be aligned to what we call TGO, their product quality standards. Now, again, this is more industry detail, and I'm not in the industry session. The process has been spelled out by industry with guidance. The industry can go to a range of different approaches for products manufactured out of standard. Now, this is all industry gobbledygook, but it actually, guess what? The industry people actually understand what this slide means, I hope. If they don't, come and talk to us. So essentially, it doesn't mean that we have to go and inspect their factory. So let's say someone wants to import cannabis from, as we do, we import some cannabis from the Netherlands. No, not from the Bulldog coffee shop, but from a company that makes quality medicinal cannabis product. We don't have to hop on an aeroplane and go and look at their factory. If, for example, the European Union has been through all that process, they can send us a paperwork. It's what we do with medicines all the time. Your COVID drugs, we weren't able to travel. So we got the paperwork from Europe and America and looked at it carefully. We weren't able to go during COVID to those countries. So most parts of the world, even South Africa, which is starting to export cannabis, we can actually use their paperwork. And because we have a collaborative network with all those other countries. That's the main take-home message from that one. New quality requirements. This had, again, we want to make sure that the products are what you get and high quality as a medicine. And there are some issues. when things are oils, when things are plant-based, cannabis is all, THC and CBD also have a degree of what we call photosensitivity. Doesn't mean they're camera shy, it means light breaks them down. And so, unlike sort of like a Panadol tablet, which is probably stable for 50 years, even though it's only got a shelf life of 3 years officially, it probably won't break down even if it was World War II. Cannabis oil does break down. So we want quality requirements, we want consistent labelling so people know what like for like. We brought in child resistant, this is all with a public consultation, and then we went and then government decided. We also cut out a few reporting requirements, so it's basically more like an auditing and compliance framework. Instead of asking every company to send in a whole lot of paperwork, we will audit either based on intelligence, called tip-offs, or randomly companies to make sure that they're aligning. But now, what does it mean for patients and prescribers? The way that active ingredients are identified is more consistent. There's more information if it is plant-derived cannabis. Child-resistant enclosures are required on all products, because remember that most products that are prescribed have THC in them. So that was an important thing. And again, I mentioned the issue with microbes and fungi. We're clear about the requirements, because frankly, if you're nebulizing or vaporizing something, you don't want it full of bugs or fungi. Now, on to advertising of medicinal cannabis products. And this is an area we often, we get told two things. We get told either we're not doing enough, or we're cramping the style of the industry and we're being unrealistic, which is a pretty normal life for a regulator. Being a regulator, 50% of your stakeholders tell you you're being too tough and 50% of them tell you you're being too slack. So we regulate the advertising of medicinal cannabis products. By the way, speaking about misleading advertising, I'm lucky the mayor has left, because maybe we should look at misleading advertising. This is a sunshine coast, for God's sake. I'd hate to see the rainy coast. Anyway, I shouldn't be cruel. This part of Australia did have about 6 or 7 years of drought. It's just that they haven't turned the tap off now. So, these are prescription medicines, and we are not in the United States of America, you might have realised. And what that means is that advertising to the public directly is not legal. So advertisers are under scrutiny. We do cut a fair bit of latitude. So there's nothing wrong with saying you're a medicinal cannabis company. There is something wrong with guaranteeing that someone will get a cannabis script. There is something wrong with advertising a medicinal cannabis product by name directly to the public, because guess what? We have these people called doctors, and the discussion about what medicine and whether a cannabis medicine is appropriate is a discussion between your doctor and you as a patient. For other medicines, we don't go in and say, I'll have 3 oxycodones, 2 benzodiazepines and a bit of amoxicillin, please. You know, this is not Woolworths. So that's why, because these are prescription medicines, that's why advertising controls come in. So but look, we spend a lot of time writing to people and saying, hey, just pull it back. You can't guarantee a script. You've got to make sure your practice, and AHPRA will do the same. We're here to make sure that, again, patient safety is paramount. And being guaranteed a prescription for anything, even if it's an antibiotic, and because of antimicrobial resistance, which you may have heard of, is not good medicine. And there are some court cases coming up. We're not here just to do that for our jollies, but for the most egregious cases. And we have issued over 90 infringement notices. They're like traffic fines, but they cost a lot more. You can dispute them in court, like a traffic fine. You can go to court and show it wasn't you who was speeding. They're worth a fair bit more, depending on whether they're companies or individuals. If they're companies, they're worth about 11,000 or 13,000, I think. It changes every year. Individuals a bit less. And similarly with importation and supply, we don't want black parallel importation things, because again, patient safety and access to quality medicines is affected. We work a lot with Border Force and MCOPPers in each state and territory, and this is our advice to industry: read what the rules are. I won't dwell. The thing I want to close with, before we have some time for questions and answers, and if there's Office of Drug Control questions, I've got my 2 colleagues here too, is really about clinical evidence. And the last 2 speakers spoke a little bit about this. And we did an unusual thing back in 2016-17 when the narcotic drugs, the new framework came in. We actually commissioned university groups, 3 universities with clinicians and so forth, And then we held meetings of 40 or 50 specialist doctors. I think, again, I'll mention, Judith, to embarrass you, you're at some of these meetings. We commissioned meetings to actually put together what we knew about the clinical evidence. Most unusual. We don't do that for other medicines. And here were the areas we covered. You can see them. And of course, some states and territories, both here in Australia and also overseas, have funded clinical trials. But while I am not wanting to discount individual, and one of the hardest things in our area of medicine is to differentiate between individual good news or bad news stories. And we heard a wonderful story about the 19-year-old university student. And the trouble is looking at clinically published results that are objective. And sadly, there have been nothing like as many positive studies as I would have hoped. If you'd asked me in 2017, now admittedly I didn't anticipate a thing called COVID, but if you'd asked me in 2017 how many positive studies we would have had, or how many studies, and sadly sometimes the studies don't end up positive. We heard about the PTSD study from Scottsdale Research Institute, although the New Mexico study was positive there. And this is often the trouble with clinical medicine. You get a positive study and a negative study. What do? Why was one positive, why was one negative? Not very many positive, or not many studies, full stop. And we've actually got out both the Australian and the overall pain chapters actually saying, well, there isn't sufficient evidence for general use of cannabinoids. Now, note, however, that the biggest thing that we approve for under the special access scheme is pain. Almost 200,000 of those scripts have been for various forms of pain. So we have a problem, Houston. And it's not really a case of saying, well, you know, those bunch of doctors, they're probably all grey-haired 60-something-year-old men. There's nothing wrong with grey-haired 60-year-old something men, by the way, being one of them. But, you know, what do they know? That's not the way. Let's take a step back and reflect. So does it matter? I mean, there's access through these authorised and special access scheme pathways. And I say, yes, it does matter. Because currently we're on a bit of an impasse. Yes, patients are getting in levels that some of the naysayers never said were possible. We were told that TGA would never be able to manage a special access scheme once it got more than 10,000 patients. I just have replaced all my staff with robots and they work 24 hours a day. No, my staff have done miracles with this, and yes, sometimes they have had to work around the clock. We have managed this scheme. But it's not so much our ability to cope with 200,000 scripts or 300,000 scripts, as I believe it is. Here are the problems. Patient confidence is greater if it's been through a full regulatory approval process. That's what we are here to do. We're here to protect public health and patients. Just as importantly, while there's an ever-increasing number of doctors and nurse prescribers and others who are confident in cannabis, there are still many who are unsure. And while on one hand we can celebrate the fact, I think it's something like 15.8% of GPs or some figure like that, give or take a percentage, have prescribed medicinal cannabis products. Guess what that means? 84% have not. And so fewer than 1 in 6 are prescribed. Doctors like to see, and you can call them old fuddy-duddies, but guess what, they're your doctors. Doctors like to see evidence in medical journals. They like to see clinical trials. They like, for any medicine. Doesn't matter if you're going there for cancer, for sleep, for depression, for anxiety, for stomach upsets. They want to see evidence. They don't want to give you a medicine that doesn't have evidence. I'm not saying cannabis doesn't have evidence, but we need it in the forms that the doctors believe in. Hospitals. We've often had trouble with hospitals either continuing or initiating medicinal cannabis products. Maybe not oncology hospitals, but general hospitals have struggled, and children's in particular hospitals, because they're saying, oh, this is a special access scheme one. We tend to prefer only putting people on approved medicines. Importantly, more medicines would be eligible for the PBS. And I'll talk about cost as I wrap up, and pharmacies that hold stock. What's needed? More successful clinical trials. They can be anywhere in the world. Australia will approve a drug based only on American, Canadian, European data. It doesn't have to be done here. Nice if it is, but it doesn't have to. And men may have to apply. To wrap up, talking about funding. A couple of things are funded, but many are not. On one hand, the cost has come down, and our friends in Freshleaf will show you their latest numbers. And for someone like me who is in a full-time job as an executive, it's 2 cups of coffee a day for many things, $300 a month. But we all know the cost of living pressures at the moment, and for someone who is not in full-time employment or on a low income, $10 a day is a big deal. For me, I can manage 2 cups of coffee. But we still have an issue with price and access. There have been some advances, as you can read on the slide, but by and large it is still an issue. So, just to wrap up, before I think we've got till 1 o'clock for a few questions, we've implemented most of the things recommended by the inquiry, but we did what government said. Rescheduling of low CBD is completed. Bring on the applications, but bring on the evidence, please. Numbers are growing quickly of prescriptions. Again, don't believe what you read in some of the industry media that says, oh, the numbers are going down of special access scheme. Why they're going down is because more people are authorised prescribers. And we only get that information 5 or 6, 7, sometimes 8 if they're slack, months later. So if you see the numbers of special access scheme going down the next month, it probably means your doctor's become an authorised prescriber, and they're going to tell us in June, July, August. There's new quality standards, and it's all about patient protection and patient confidence. We are policing advertising. It's a little bit like whack-a-mole, and we're again not doing it just to be big brother regulator. Again, we're here to protect patients from what it should be a doctor-patient discussion. And my dream is that we get more approved products for cannabis on the register based on evidence, because then all the things like the potential for PBS funding, lower cost to patients, confidence by doctors, the other 5, 6 of the doctors prescribing will come. End of my lecture. Thanks very much.
Alrighty, wonderful. Thank you so much, John. We've got a bit of time now for a Q&A, and I believe that also in the audience you have Avi Ribera from the Office of Drug Control and Danielle Chifley as well. Is that right? Yep. Wonderful. So, okay, I'm sure there's loads of questions. Who's going first?
One over there, I think.
Oh, one over there.
Gentleman there.
I'll come back to you.
Sorry? I can see up here.
Alrighty.
Hi, John. So far we're only talking about the CBD and THC as a pharmaceutical medicine. So what is the TGA's position in terms of registering hemp-derived CBD dominant whole plant extract under Austell or Austell A program?
It's not Austell. There's nothing short. There's no problem with a whole plant extract being registered as a medicine. There's one called Sativax for multiple sclerosis. So one thing that's often misquoted is, oh, TGA and other regulators can't register whole plant extracts. We have several whole plant extracts for different plant things on our register, including that. It's to do with the scheduling of product. These are prescription medicines, so they're not Austell. They're Ostar Schedule 4 or Schedule 8 prescription medicines because of the psychoactive nature of THC.
Where was that other hand? It was just over here somewhere. Okay.
2 over there.
Wonderful.
Thanks, John, for that talk. It's really great to hear your insights. I'm just curious, what sort of resources do you allocate to keeping up to date with the overwhelmingly large body of research that's readily available everywhere?
So, look, we have a few of us keep up to date with the major things happening in the research. As a regulator, our role is not to be the world's expert on every one of the... We have 95,000 products on our register, by the way. So while our role is to keep up to date with the general... And I do have several dozen doctors who work for us. Just recently reappointed Chief Medical Advisor. I come from a technical background. So we do keep up with the broad themes in the research and the broad papers, and I was already aware of the Scottsdale results, of the New Mexico results, for example, from my keeping up. Our role is if a regulatory submission is given to us, that it be balanced. So the first thing we'll do, let's say we get a study for a Schedule 3 or a Schedule 4 product for sleep. We will want to look at the entirety of the research on sleep, because what companies can't do is cherry pick one positive study and ignore 25 negative ones. So in that way, once we get an application for a particular product, we are very close to the research. But in general, we do have a bit of a horizon scanning role, and I'm part of that, as are several of our other staff.
Tamara Nation, I'm from Melbourne. I'm a GP. Thank you for a really great and fun talk. One question I have for you is when you brought about the category changes, I really felt that it was a sudden change and there hadn't been adequate education prior to that. What's your impression?
We actually, that again followed consultation. Now, one of the challenges is communication with GPs about that. And so internal communication with GPs about medicinal cannabis, we can always do a lot more. And so it's hard. We don't have a budget for communication with GPs. So we scrimp and save and do bits and pieces of general communication. In fact, had I not been here, and now it will now be 2 weeks' time on a Saturday, I'm actually meeting with the president of the RACGP, who I know quite well, and a couple of senior GPs to look at how RACGP can be involved more in GP education about medicinal cannabis. So if you want to go and lobby Karen Price ahead of my meeting with her, please do so. But look, it is a challenge. We actually do not have a budget for education, which, although it's an expectation of a modern regulator, but we're one of a few regulators in the world that doesn't get a budget to do education. So we do education. I just pinch little bits of money around the traps to do it. But we want to do more of that in partnership with groups like RACGP.
Thank you for speaking. It's a lovely talk. I'm a GP and authorised prescriber for both Category 1 up to Category 5. One of the issues I have is that the TGA seems to be concerned with THC and CBD, but there's a whole stack of other compounds there. So when we're prescribing, say, from Category 3, and we're able to give a variety of products from that Category 3, even within the one series of batches, we're going to get different cannabinoids, different terpenes, which have a different spectrum of behavior. So it seems that by doing the category approach there, it's actually made it more difficult for the individual patient to be stabilized.
Well, it's really, again, I go back to, I mean, as a GP, you'll know, for example, that even with generic, I don't know if you've done any follow-up prescribing of other, well, you will have done it for antidepressants and also for perhaps in conjunction with neurologists, anti-seizure drugs. It's not uncommon for a GP to want to keep a patient on a particular named brand. And I've just mentioned 2 other categories where it's quite common for GPs and specialists to do that. You have every right to write on your script, I want this brand with this spectrum of extracts only. So we haven't taken away that right from GPs. Now, for some patients, you may feel that that's an important thing to tick. The same way for some patients and prescriptions, it's important for other areas in other therapeutic areas. So you have that right and that ability to mark that on your script. Other times, it may not be as critical for that patient, but we've retained the right for that. We haven't taken it away. Happy to talk to you bilaterally about that.
Yeah, just over this side.
Oh, there we are. Sorry, I've got all these lights shining me in my face, so it's hard to see out there.
Not a problem. Look, my question centres around authorised prescribing indications and evidence, as you discussed. As an authorised prescriber, I've often thought, based on the indications I've had, why is cannabis replacement therapy not an option as an indication for prescribing cannabis, given all the sort of side effects you discussed, such as, for example, inhaling a fungus? And if I was, as a authorized prescriber, to go down that route, would I need to put in a different SAS application? And when it comes to evidence, what type of evidence do I need to provide, given the harms associated with illicit cannabis smoking rather than through a vape?
So it's not correct to say that TGA has said that's not an indication. Remember, I'll go back to my earlier comment, we do not have a list of permitted and non-permitted indications. If you're an authorised prescriber for a higher THC product, and the situation that you're talking about will be the higher THC products, you need to get approval, as you do as an authorised prescriber for any other pharmaceutical, except for low CBD products. You need to get approval from an appropriate ethics committee, human research and ethics committee. The big hospitals have these, there's a whole host of them. And it's up to the ethics committee to decide whether they will support you as an authorised prescriber for that indication. It's not TGA. So you'll need to work that through with the relevant ethics committee, but there's no TGA control on that. And if you're supported by an ethics committee, we'd certainly tick it off.
Hi, John, over here. Oh. Thank you for your talk. I just have a question about getting approval for compounded products. Do we need to have any specific justification? Because I'm a GP in New South Wales, and getting state health approval is almost impossible. You know, the cost of products is obviously significant for patients, and the compounded products are significantly cheaper, and they said, you know, cost cannot be a justification.
Well, that's an issue under New South Wales law. New South Wales has particular regulations around compounding. I should go back to scratch, but in general, and now I'm talking about the Pharmacy Board, who regulates pharmacists across Australia. In general, compounding is only to be used when a commercial product is not suitable for a patient or available. Some states and territories like New South Wales have additional constraints. So, and I know I'm sounding like a bureaucrat passing the buck because that's what I'm exactly doing. That's a New South Wales health issue. So you'll need to take that argument up with New South Wales Health. We don't, the only regulation we require on compounding is that it has to go through SAS or AP, but as I've said, SAS is generally a same-day process.
So we don't need to put any specific justification to get TGA approval?
It's generally wise to explain why you're going to a compounded product for that, but our main focus will be on the composition of a product, you know, that you're not giving very high THC to a toddler.
And do we, if obviously I'm in New South Wales, so if I tick the state health approval box through the SASB application, that will automatically go to state health and...
Yeah, the process is changing with the state and territory health departments as I speak, because remember I said at the very beginning that many of them have now got out of the kitchen, unless, for example, it's for someone with a history of drug dependence or whatever. So there are some states and territories, and I know the New South Wales government has this particular interest in compounding. So look, if you've got a more specific inquiry, I'm happy to take the details. It's just a moving feast. Things are changing as I speak.
Hey, John, I'll stand up so you can see where I am. It's Martin Lane from Cannabis, and I am standing up, just if anyone wants to do that joke. Just, you talked about doctors requiring evidence. Do you think that because of the stigma associated with cannabis that it's held to a higher standard than other medicines?
I believe there is a stigma with cannabis with some doctors. Now, it's better for colleagues here, whether they're GPs or specialists, to comment on whether they still see that. I think there is. I am not convinced it's held to a higher standard. Remember, the difference between cannabis and all the other medicines that doctors might prescribe as unapproved medicines is all the others, essentially, are approved in other countries as pharmaceuticals. So we have unapproved medicines that have been approved by the British government, our equivalent in England, and the only reason they're not approved in Australia is it might be for a rare disease in a small market here. So I do not believe that they're being held to higher standards, but I do agree with you that some doctors still see a stigma with being associated with medicinal cannabis.
Sorry, back over here. I'm a sleep physician in New South Wales and an authorised prescriber. I just wanted to ask about adolescent medicine. I do a lot of adolescent medicine. I've got a lot of kids with insomnia, anxiety, PTSD, cannabis misuse, autistic kids as well. And when particularly the autistic kids, as you know, for behavioural issues, they do extremely well with a bit of THC. But when I've done the SASB, because they're minors, then, you know, the response from the teacher has been, you needed a paediatrician to sign it off. But I've never met I'm married to one, but I've never met one who will prescribe medicinal cannabis almost.
It is one of those, and look, I don't want to go into individual patient situations for confidentiality and privacy reasons. As I've said, our people do look more closely at paediatric prescribing. There are some studies underway that you will be familiar with on potential for cannabis products in autism and treatment of either autism obsession or alternatively autism social behavioural issues. For other reasons, I actually know a lot about autistic spectrum disorder. I'm happy to talk to you privately about that. Again, there's a range of views about the outcomes of those trials, and because it is a an area where there's a lot of contention, and because we're dealing with younger kids, in those sorts of areas we are encouraging there to be a paediatrician involved. And so, you know, it's not sort of clipping your wings as a GP. It would be the same often if a GP, say, wanted to initiate high-dose CBD prescribing for a kid with a genetic epilepsy. We'd say, hey, talk to a neurologist. But I do know that it's an area still that's developing. I really have hope that there'll be some real breakthroughs for cannabis medicines in treating autism spectrum disorder, but we've got to get the evidence.
Hi, up the back here. Hello. I'm just wondering if you could comment on the rationale within the TGA of when you move to category prescription, keeping each dosage form, like flower, oil, capsule, so if I want to be authorised for Schedule 1 to 5 in all dosage forms, I have to put in like 400 applications to be an AP. Was there any reason, was it just for monitoring purposes?
It is because while you could argue the pharmacokinetics, which is actually how much cannabis comes out of whatever you're doing. So for example, when you're vaporising, you get a faster hit, goes into your bloodstream and your brain faster. If you put an oil or a wafer, it goes into the body slower. Medical people like me call that pharmacokinetics. But anyway, that's important to know because it's different for the different products. So on one hand, we wanted simplicity with those categories. On the other hand, we need to get a feel, especially in looking at appropriateness. So the same for what's been done. So for example, the same dose of cannabis can actually have a hugely different impact depending on whether it's, for example, vaporized or that. So it's really to do with the pharmacokinetics. There's differences also between pharmacokinetics of different oral dose forms, but happy to take up, that's a rather technical question, happy to take it up with you bilaterally.
Maybe you can ambush John at lunch or something.
After I get something to eat.
Yes, exactly. And on that note, I'm sorry, guys, we will have to wrap up the session. We'll come back a couple of minutes after, maybe 1:35, so just extend your lunch a little bit. But thank you so much for taking part in the Q&A.